Make no mistake about it. When the Nature Boy Ric Flair endorses your product with his presence, you automatically become big time.
For this video, I want to take you back to a different time in wrestling. Back when there was one major company, a distant second, and an even more distant everyone else. Amongst that everyone else, Ring of Honor was a growing company that showed promise, but it had been built on the efforts of its largely homegrown talent, many of whom would become superstars, but weren't there yet. They needed something more if they were going to grow past being a small company reliant on DVD sales. They were going to need a star to give them legitimacy with the wider wrestling audience, and of all people, they managed to recruit the dirtiest player in the game. But what would happen when Ric Flair would enter Ring of Honor? First, we'll look at the changing landscape of ROH at the time, then where Ric Flair's career was, and the timeline of his relationship with the indie. Finally, we'll try to figure out what went wrong and how it happened. The late 2000s were a very pivotal time in Ring of Honor's history, in terms of changes that impacted the entire company. Since the start of the promotion, all wrestlers and storylines have been booked largely by one man, Gabe Sapolsky. Gabe had spent the previous years before ROH working for ECW, but more importantly, he spent those years sitting under the learning tree of Paul Heyman himself. Gabe's booking from the early ROH years is still fondly remembered by fans 2 decades later. From the beloved Summer of Punk to the nearly 2-year reign of Samoa Joe as world champion. Many wrestlers that Gabe brought into Ring of Honor went on to become big stars, proving that he had an extraordinary eye for talent. On the screen right now is not even a complete list of the sheer talent Gabe had influence on in their early years. In late 2008, then owner Cary Silkin made the decision to remove Gabe from his position as booker, after about 6.5 years in the job. Gabe, who admitted afterwards that he'd been feeling burned out after putting all of his focus into ROH, was great at drawing in the fan that wanted a stronger style of wrestling. But Cary felt the company would need to change its product to be more accessible in order to grow the company. Cary was mostly a fairly passive owner, leaving the day-to-day operations to his booker and other staff, but stepped in when he saw the company's decline in live attendance and DVD sales throughout 2008, which were vital to keeping the company afloat. Aside from any revenue ROH made, Cary had put a lot of his own money into the company, and didn't want to lose any more. When Gabe left, Cary replaced him with an interesting choice, an active wrestler who appeared to have a good relationship with a lot of the locker room, Scrap Iron Adam Pearce, who at the time was also the NWA World Champion, wrestling all over the US and internationally. The same Adam Pearce seen on WWE television today. When Pearce was tasked with wrestling Roman Reigns on SmackDown a couple of years ago, I hoped we might see shades of the old Scrap Iron, but sadly we didn't. When Adam took over the ROH product, there became a very clear change. The excellent quality of wrestling was still there, especially in their main events, and in the matches there was less emphasis on high spots, but the overall tone of the shows felt lighter and more family friendly. One of Gabe's final projects, a dark, emo stable known as the Age of the Fall, became very much toned down in terms of its violent nature. This is a group that debuted under Gabe by hanging an already bleeding Jay Briscoe by his feet from the loop that had been used to hang the belts up from a ladder match. The group's leader, Jimmy Jacobs, then proceeded to cut a promo standing underneath, as Briscoe's blood dripped down onto Jacobs' white suit, creating one of the most stunning moments in Ring of Honor history. Under Pearce, there was none of that, and the group's future prospect was quickly separated from the group and pushed as a single star. That prospect was a young Tyler Black, known today as Seth Rollins. The changes to the product can maybe be best visualized in the transformation of one of ROH's top wrestlers at the time, Austin Aries. Around the time of Gabe's last shows, Aries was presented as a very serious wrestler, the man who ended Samoa Joe's epic world title reign, who was going to time limit draws with Bryan Danielson, and who was battling Jimmy Jacobs in brutal matches. By mid-2009, Aries was almost a completely different wrestler, undergoing a vast makeover, adopting flashy new ring gear and style. This was then validated by Aries defeating Jerry Lynn to become the first ever two-time ROH World Champion, a title that he held until Tyler Black was ready to ascend to the throne in the following year. The newly christened A-Double felt like the figurehead of ROH's new direction, which was propelled forward by another major change, ROH's first foray into national television. On March 21, 2009, Ring of Honor debuted ROH on HDNet. While HDNet was a start for the company, it wasn't the most accessible channel, as to my understanding, you needed an extra package on your cable just to have the channel. Years later, HDNet owner Mark Cuban would sell the channel, and it would become known as Access TV, the current home of Impact Wrestling. The weekly 1-hour show at the time felt very different to the televised products of WWE and TNA. One reason for this was ROH taping as many as 6 episodes over a weekend, usually from the former ECW arena. This meant that you only saw the big stars of ROH every few weeks as opposed to every single week on Raw. As a fan at the time, I kinda liked this, as I might get a 30-minute Bryan Danielson match one week, and it gave me enough time to look forward to seeing Bryan wrestle again in a few weeks. The show was clearly aimed less at ROH's already die-hard fanbase and more at casual or new fans. Character babyfaces like Delirious and, weirdly, the Necro Butcher were featured, as well as traditional heels like the Embassy, who a new fan would instantly recognise to be the bad guys. The birth of the HDNet show also brought something ROH had rarely used in the past, an on-screen authority figure. Jim Cornette had previously, and would again in the future, take the role, especially during the well-regarded ROH vs CZW feud. But ROH wanted a bigger name for the HDNet show, which is where Ric Flair comes in. Much like for Ring of Honor, 2008 was something of a transition year for Ric Flair too. Flair entered the year with a storyline in which Vince McMahon would force him to retire the next time he lost a match, which led to many near misses for Flair. This was slowly leading to one of the biggest matches of his 36-year-long in-ring career, which would take place at WrestleMania 24. Throughout the whole of WrestleMania weekend, you could say that Flair was the star attraction. On the Saturday night, he was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame as the featured inductee, alongside Mae Young, Rocky Johnson, High Chief Peter Maivia, the father and grandfather of The Rock, famed announcer Gordon Solie, Florida promoter Eddie Graham, and Gerald and Jack Briscoe. Flair would again be inducted in 2012 as a member of the Four Horsemen, making him the first of currently 8 wrestlers to be inducted twice, as groups like the NWO, DX, the Hart Foundation, and Harlem Heat would follow. On March 30th at WrestleMania 24, Rick wrestled what was to be his final match against Shawn Michaels. While not a perfect match, it had enough story and drama in it that fans were truly along for the ride. Capped off by Shawn's famous "I'm sorry, I love you" moment. Fairly early in, Shawn would suffer a cracked rib that would go on to hinder him for the rest of the match. The injury came when Shawn would perform an Asai moonsault to the outside of the ring, missing Flair and landing ribs first on the spine of the Spanish announce table. Apart from this scary moment, Ric Flair claimed while discussing the match on his podcast that the rest of the match went according to plan, and was always going to end with the sweet chin music. He also claimed, however, that the famous line from Shawn Michaels hadn't been planned, or at least Flair didn't know it was coming. Clearly, production must have known that the line was coming, since the camera was there to get a perfect shot of Shawn mouthing the words. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Flair knew. On Raw the next night, the show ended with tributes to Ric Flair. He he was honoured in the ring by many of his peers, from Triple H to members of the Horsemen to his family, including a pre-wrestling Charlotte, and eventually the entire roster. After the program went off the air, Flair, who by this point had no more tears left in his body, was even shown the ultimate respect by The Undertaker in a somewhat in and out of character moment. The entire weekend felt like the perfect send-off for the Nature Boy. More on that later. While Rick would make a couple of appearances on Raw, it seemed that his days in the ring were done. So what did Ric Flair actually do in Ring of Honor? On March 13th, 2009, ROH presented a show titled Styling and Profiling because of Flair's presence. He was there to observe the main event, the ROH World title match between Nigel McGuinness, who was nearing the end of his epic 16-month-long reign, and his challenger for the night, Brent Albright, the man briefly known as Gunner Scott for a few months on SmackDown. The match would end in disqualification, as Claudio Castagnoli would interfere on Nigel's behalf, and Flair would actually enter the ring to make the save. Around this time, Ring of Honor would announce that Flair would become an ROH ambassador, and heavily promoted him for their new HDNet show. He would make his first TV appearance on May 2nd, 2009. He begins the show with an in-ring promo complimenting ROH in the most Ric Flair way, by claiming that the next Flair, Shawn Michaels or Triple H might be in the ROH locker room, which is not exactly what a die-hard ROH fan would have wanted to hear, given that many of them loved indie wrestling for not being like WWE. He was then interrupted by Austin Aries, planting seeds for what would come later. On the following week's episode, Flair would appear in a backstage interview, talking up the roster, whose names I bet he couldn't have told us without a prompter. On the May 16th episode, he heads to the ring again, this time to announce a 4-way match for the Ring of Honor World title, in which the new champion, who by this point had dethroned Nigel, Jerry Lynn, would defend against Austin Aries, Bryan Danielson and Tyler Black. On the June 6th episode, Rick would be interviewed before the 4-way that I just mentioned, and would talk about the importance of being in a world title match. As best I can tell, all of these episodes would have been taped in early April at the second ever HDNet tapings. 1 week later on the June 13th episode, which would have been the first of a new set of tapings, commentators Dave Prazak and Mike Hogwood would note that Ric Flair had stepped down as ROH's ambassador, and he wouldn't be seen in the company again. Soon in the authority role he would be replaced by Jim Cornette. Aside from the HDNet show, at this time ROH was running events that were primarily released on DVD, a huge aspect of their income, especially in the early years. While Ric Flair appeared on the aforementioned Styling and Profiling show, he was next advertised to appear at The Hunt Begins on April 17th in Montreal, but apparently no-showed the event. Undoubtedly, the biggest wrestling-related catastrophe to ever hit the city of Montreal. Following this event, Ric Flair would not be advertised again, and eventually ROH would sue Ric Flair for money that he had been paid in advance to appear. The lawsuit revealed that Ring of Honor were paying Flair $10,000 per appearance, and $35,000 on top of that to be their ambassador on the HDNet show, though ROH was claiming that Flair owed them a total of $40,000. According to a 2011 article by Cageside Seats, part of Rick's conditions for a booking included a refundable $5,000 deposit, and this may contribute to the amount ROH was owed for not being the ambassador and no showing in Montreal. When Ric Flair officially left Ring of Honor, he claimed that he did so he could go back to WWE, which he technically did, making a very brief comeback, and by very brief, I mean 2 weeks. He would get into an in-ring dispute with Randy Orton on the May 25th, 2009 episode of Raw, and a week later he would receive a dreaded Orton punt kick, and would disappear again. It turns out, based on what happened next, that Flair may have used his WWE link to get out of his ROH deal, possibly in order to explore some other opportunities. It seems like following Flair's brief WWE return, some sort of resolution was made with ROH, as Ric would appear on 4 events in June and 1 in July. In these appearances, Flair would do an autograph signing, and during the show cut a short promo about his memories of the city they were in. As best I can tell, these will be Flair's final ROH shows. In November of 2009, Flair would break his in-ring retirement, wrestling on the Hulkamania Let the Battle Begin tour in Australia. I won't go into too much detail here, as that tour definitely deserves its own deep dive. But Flair crucially would wrestle in 4 main events, losing to Hulk Hogan every time. The next time Flair would be seen on a major platform would be a night etched in the memories of every TNA fan at the time, January 4th, 2010. The debut of the ill-fated attempt by TNA to compete head-to-head with Raw, which only lasted around 3 months. The first episode featured a former WWE star either debuting or returning in what felt like every single segment, including Ric Flair, who would be paired with TNA champion AJ Styles. Flair would stay in TNA for 2 years, wrestling 12 matches before eventually making his way back to occasional WWE appearances. Michael Bocchicchio, which by the way I apologise if I'm saying wrong, is a former friend of Ric, who I'll return to in the next section. He alleged in a 2011 interview with Cageside Seats that TNA offered Ric a $400,000 per year deal. Given how Ring of Honor weren't using him on every show, he was never going to make the kind of money TNA was offering while in the much smaller Ring of Honor. It's worth pointing out though that that number could be a little bit inflated, as another article I read put Flair at around the $264,000 a year mark. Either way, that's still more than he was going to make in Ring of Honor. Until his to-date final match in 2022, his last would have been a loss to Sting on a 2011 episode of Impact, but more problems continued to follow Flair. From what I can tell, ROH eventually sued Flair in 2011, citing that he had been with TNA for long enough that he could feasibly afford to pay them back. But from what I can tell, the ROH vs Flair lawsuit never really went anywhere. I've also seen it claimed that when Sinclair Broadcasting purchased Ring of Honor in 2011, they had no interest in pursuing the former owner's debts, which might be accurate, as Carey seems to be claiming that it was his own money and not ROH's. Over the years, Ric Flair has been fairly quiet about Ring of Honor, but in March of this year he was directly asked about them on his podcast. Ric claimed, talking to Conrad Thompson, that the deal fell through when someone asked him to badmouth WWE in a promo, but never really explains any further. In his exact words, Flair says, "They asked me to go out and say that they were a bigger product than WWE, but I said I'll absolutely never do that. They said you're under contract. Say what you're told. And I said I'm under contract for that. Not for that. I won't do it." That's all it was. Simple as that. He also briefly implies that ROH's plan for him was to go to a strip club before the show, but that gets glossed over and we don't ever get any detail as to what he meant by that. Flair also doesn't say who they are who told him to do this, and moves on to burying Bocchicchio. Around this time, Ring of Honor would never really bury other promotions on screen, except in agreed upon promotional feuds like with CZW and later Chikara, so this claim doesn't feel like the true story. With respect to Conrad, he could have grilled Ric on this statement a bit more, maybe ask for clarification. Flair's 2023 comments again caused Carey Silkin to reiterate that Flair owed him the 41 grand. Not sure where that extra $1,000 came from. Money Carey will frankly never likely see. In the podcast, Flair also claims that the ROH deal was put together by the owner of High Spots, Michael Bocchicchio, who I mentioned earlier, who has had his own financial disputes with Ric. In researching for this video, I found a story of Flair giving High Spots an NWA Championship belt as collateral for a loan. According to High Spots, Flair never repaid the loan, leading to them attempting to sell the belt, but they quickly found out that it wasn't theirs to sell, as Flair had previously offered the same belt as collateral to a company called Conbraco Industries for a different loan. Conbraco, by the way, was a plumbing and heating valve company to make this even stranger. The article I found this information in at Cageside Seats claims that Flair also gave Combraco more items as collateral, most notably his first WWE Hall of Fame ring and the Rolex watch that Shawn Michaels gifted him following WrestleMania 24. And weirdly, an autographed poster of Michael Jordan. Weeks later, Dave Meltzer would clarify that the owner of Combraco was a friend of Flair, so that at least makes some sense. To be clear though, these are all allegations, and the money disputes between Flair and High Spots are very, very messy, so I'll include a link to the multiple articles in my blog, which can be found in the description if you'd like some further reading. Frankly, I wouldn't have known about any of this had Flair not mentioned the High Spots owner instead of focusing on Ring of Honor. To be clear, as best I can find, Ric Flair has never given a clear and concise explanation for his Ring of Honor run, other than his bad-mouthing WWE claim. He did reference this same claim against ROH in 2022 on an earlier version of his podcast with Mark Madden, another longtime friend who Flair fell out with, so he at least is consistent with this claim. There is, however, another theory about what might have happened, but I want to make it clear that this shouldn't be treated as absolute fact, and it will get quite dark. It's been speculated that Flair made the deal with ROH partly to guarantee his son Reed a spot on their roster, only for this to never happen when Reed was arrested for driving while impaired, right before Rick would appear for the company, but after he'd been advertised. The timeline for this does add up, as Reed spent much of 2008 training to wrestle with Harley Race, and made his in-ring debut in December of that year, teaming with his brother David. He was arrested on March 4th, right before Flair's first ROH appearance, and again on April 26th, which was after the show that Flair didn't turn up for. Maybe ROH denied using Reed, who according to his cage match had only wrestled one match by the time of Flair's first appearance, not including the two he had in 2000 WCW as a child by the way, and so Flair reneged on his deal. When Reed sadly passed away at the age of 25, Mike Johnson of PW Insider, as well as other obituaries, noted that he had been slated to work for ROH, but his arrest caused this not to happen, with Johnson in particular claiming that this might have led to Flair deciding to no longer appear for the company. When I first read this, I was very skeptical, as Flair probably could have got Reed straight into WWE with his connections. So why would he have joined an indie just to get him a spot? When Rey Mysterio returned to WWE, it was fairly common knowledge that he was doing so to ensure that Dominic would get an opportunity to bypass the indies and train within WWE. So the idea that Flair couldn't do that initially felt suspect to me. At first I wondered if Flair might have felt that Reed should go to the indies because of what happened with David Flair, who was pushed straight onto Nitro, and that didn't end well. I thought maybe that could have been Flair's approach, but it turns out that years later, in a 30 for 30 documentary about Ric Flair, Triple H explained that Reed was on course to join WWE, but wasn't signed as he failed 2 drug tests. So maybe WWE just wasn't an option for the time being. It's ironic in a way, that the wrestler most famous for embodying the lifestyle of the rich and famous, the limousine riding, jet flying, and all the rest son of a gun, famous for living the gimmick, has been plagued by money troubles in the latter years of his life, that grew more and more complicated. In researching Flair's life around this time, I read some truly harrowing stories about his finances, his relationships, and even his health. They're out there if you choose to find them, but I don't want to turn this into a dark side of the ring. I'll instead leave you with a reminder of the amazing highs of Flair's long and successful time in the ring. Because as the song chosen for Flair's retirement says, leave the memories alone. Thank you for watching yet another wrestling channel. If you enjoyed this, please comment, like or subscribe.